Hello, welcome once again to Leto's Law. I'm Steve Leto. Today we're talking about the 100-mile Constitution-free zone that wraps this country. And it's a bizarre concept, and a lot of people don't know about this. But I recently talked about how I crossed over from Canada into the U.S., and I crossed that border a couple times traveling to New York a couple days ago. And so as you cross the border, you realize, I'm actually leaving America. I'm entering another country. It has different laws over here. And then when you go to re-enter America, you always feel funny because it's like, I live in America. I am an American citizen. But I get quizzed at the border as if I'm a stranger, asking for permission to enter someone else's house. And so you always feel funny doing that. But you understand why it's happening. So you think to yourself, well, this is just what we put up with. This is the cost of doing business, I guess. But there's a problem that's been brought to the attention of many people by several organizations, including the ACLU, but this has been widely reported. And I mentioned before that the Supreme Court has said, look, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, do mean that you should be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Unreasonable searches and seizures. So generally speaking, the cops can't just walk up to you at random and search you for no reason. Okay, that'd be an unreasonable search. And if they kept you, it'd be seizure. Or took your stuff. The problem we have, apparently, and this is not as well known as it ought to be, is that the Border Patrol and the Customs people have control of our border. If you look at the United States, we are a large country with a large border. And I actually live in a border state because I live in Michigan. And there are portions of Michigan where you can stand on the shore and look across and see Canada. And if you're on the northern shore of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you can look across and see Lake Superior. And you'll have to trust me on this one, but the other side of Lake Superior, more Canada. So, I live in a border state. Well, it turns out that intrusion that you encounter when you're crossing the border and they can check you and ask to look in the trunk of your car for no reason, look at your luggage if you have any, make you get out of the car, they can search your car. They can do all these things without any reason or suspicion at the border that they cannot do in the interior of the country. So most people say, well, I understand that. We want to make sure that our borders are secure. What many people don't understand is that the border is not a line like you have in geometry class, where a line is, between 2 points, but it has no actual thickness. Because the border, as far as the Border Patrol and the immigration people are concerned, is 100 miles thick. It's 100 miles thick. So if you are within 100 miles of the border, immigration will tell you they've got the right to search you and check you out to make sure that you're not running afoul of the immigration laws. Now, I know many of you are saying, but Steve, aren't they just going after illegal aliens? Isn't that what they're supposed to be doing? Well, again, we get into a gray area here. And if the gray area is 100 miles deep, you have to understand what that means. The entire state of Florida is within 100 miles of a border. The entire state of Michigan is within 100 miles of a border. The entire state of Maine is within 100 miles of a border. So what that means is that the entire state is fair game for the immigration folks to be doing what they do at the border, because they consider the entire state to be the border. And it's that kind of twisted logic, I think, that upsets many people, rightfully so, because it bothers me. When you have to contort the logic to explain it to somebody, and you go, wait a second, a Border Patrol guy can go 100 miles into the state and at the 100-mile marker do stuff that we'd find normal at the border, but do it 100 miles in? That seems wrong. But here's what's going on. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, like I told you, the Bill of Rights, protects Americans from random and arbitrary stops and searches, right? Well, according to the government, these basic constitutional principles do not apply fully at the borders. And again, like I said, that makes sense. So at a port of entry, at the border, federal authorities do not need a warrant or even suspicion of wrongdoing to justify conducting what courts have called a routine search, such as searching luggage or a vehicle. Okay, we've learned to live with that. That makes sense to us. But in places far removed from the border, deep into the interior of the country, immigration officials enjoy broad powers. Now, these are not limitless powers, but they're pretty broad. Specifically, federal regulations give U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the CBP, authorities to operate within 100 miles of any U.S. external boundary. This is the 100-mile zone, okay? Border Patrol agents have certain additional authorities in that. For instance, Border Patrol can operate immigration checkpoints. So people have asked me, they said, Steve, I understand about sobriety checkpoints that they set up on a holiday weekend, and they stop everybody briefly to see if anybody's been drinking and driving. But I'm 99 miles from the border, and all of a sudden I run into a checkpoint, and it's immigration checking my citizenship status. Is that legal? According to this thought process, it is. Border Patrol cannot pull anyone over without reasonable suspicion of an immigration violation or crime, and Border Patrol cannot search vehicles in the 100-mile zone without a warrant or probable cause. But here's the issue. In practice, Border Patrol agents routinely ignore or misunderstand the limits of their legal authority, and they do conduct individual stops, resulting in violations of the constitutional rights of innocent people. These problems are compounded by inadequate training for Border Patrol agents, a lack of oversight by the CBP, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the consistent failure of the CBP to hold agents accountable for abuse. And that's, of course, because they're often abusing the rights of people who are presumably of questionable citizenship. So no matter what CBP officers and Border Patrol agents think, our Constitution does apply throughout the United States, including within the 100-mile border zone. Now, this is, of course, the ACLU writing. That's their opinion. But again, these people don't have unlimited rights. But you hear stories of a Greyhound bus driving down the middle of Florida, and it gets stopped by immigration who come on board and walk up and down the aisles asking people their immigration status. And it can happen anywhere in Michigan, anywhere in Maine, like I said, and anywhere within 100 miles of any border, including the coastal ocean areas. So this is roughly 2/3 of the American population lives in this zone where this could happen. Many people think that border-related policies only impact people living in border towns like El Paso or San Diego or Detroit. The reality is that Border Patrol's interior enforcement operations encroach deep into and across the United States, affecting the majority of Americans. Like I said, almost 2/3 of Americans live in that strip 100 miles from a border. About 200 million people. Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont lie entirely or almost entirely within 100 miles of a border, meaning they're in that zone where these things happen. 9 of the 10 largest U.S. metropolitan areas, according to the 2010 census, also fall within the zone. New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, and San Jose. Again, those cities and metropolitan areas are entirely within those zones. So these regulations that established a 100-mile border zone were adopted in 1953 by the Department of Justice without any public comment or public debate. And at the time, there were 1,100 Border Patrol agents. Today, there are 21,000. And again, you might say, well, Steve, there's 21,000 Border Patrol agents because they've got a huge job to do. Yeah, they do. But of course, that doesn't mean that they should just run roughshod over constitutional rights doing their job. So the Border Patrol often also ignores the regulation. They often reject geographic limitation on agents' authorities. At least 2 federal circuit courts, however, have condoned Border Patrol operations outside the 100-mile zone. So it could actually happen beyond that. Federal border agents are stopping, interrogating, and searching Americans on an everyday basis with absolutely no suspicion of wrongdoing, and often in ways that our Constitution does not permit. For example, Border Patrol, according to news reports, operate approximately 170 interior checkpoints throughout the country, although they never exactly give the exact figure. The ACLU believes these checkpoints amount to dragnet, suspicionless stops that cannot be reconciled with Fourth Amendment protections. Now, the Supreme Court has upheld the use of immigration checkpoints, but only insofar as the stops consist only of a brief and limited inquiry into residence status. Okay? Once they've determined whether or not you're a resident, or if they've actually a legal resident, or they've actually done enough to figure that out, they're supposed to let you go. Okay? Checkpoints cannot be primarily used for drug search or general law enforcement efforts. At least these can't. In practice, our Border Patrol agents often do not limit themselves to brief immigration inquiries and regularly conduct criminal investigations and illegal searches at checkpoints. The Border Patrol also frequently pulls over motorists in roving patrol stops, often without any suspicion that an immigration violation has occurred. So, Border Patrol can pull you over, ask you, are you a citizen? Now, again, I know a lot of people say it's never happened to me, so I don't care. You know, one of the things about the Constitution, many of the things in the Constitution will never affect you, in the Bill of Rights. But one of the things about America, I think, that makes us great is that we recognize that there are rights that all of us have. We cherish those rights, and we don't want them abused against us. And we recognize if they get abused against somebody else, that could be us. It might not be us right now, but it could be us. So, have some empathy. The ACLU has documented numerous cases of abuse by Border Patrol and filed lawsuits to obtain more information about these practices. But given Border Patrol's lack of transparency and in the absence of meaningful oversight, there's still much that we don't know. So they said this is part, in their opinion, of a broader problem. The spread of border-related powers inland is inseparable from the broader expansion of government intrusion in the lives of ordinary Americans. For example, CBP claims the authority to conduct suspicionless searches of travelers' electronic devices, such as laptops and cell phones. And they do this at ports of entry, which, again, I can understand it at a port of entry. But these searches are particularly invasive as a result of the wealth of personal information stored on these devices. At least one circuit court has held that federal officers must have at least reasonable suspicion prior to conducting such a search, and recent Supreme Court precedent seems to support the view. But again, it's not clear, and you have a federal agency that appears to be just doing this, and they say, well, we have a good reason for doing it, therefore, that's why we do it. And of course, what they say about the road to places being paved with good intentions. But again, I think if you just took a poll to get an idea of which way the wind is blowing on this, most Americans understand that there's a need for laws and law enforcement. But there's also a fear of this encroaching police state, okay? And you don't have to have it happen to you to say, oh, now I'm worried about it. When you read the news, watch TV, watch the news, watch YouTube, listen to your friends, wherever you get your information from, and you hear about intrusions by the government into your life in whatever manner, you recognize that the intrusions are rarely for the better. Your life is usually better off with fewer intrusions by the federal government. So the idea that the Border Patrol can conduct their business 100 miles in from the border as well as at the border. I think most people, when they hear that, they go, really? Doesn't seem right. But sadly, many people go, I've never been stopped. Why would it matter? And most people also, and I hate to say this, they go, look at you, Steve. They're never going to stop you and ask you, are you a citizen? You look like you probably are one because you got blonde hair and that pale skin of yours. I could be Canadian. But again, like I said, the Constitution doesn't just protect people who aren't being looked at by anybody. It should protect everybody. And so that's the concern. So again, this is something I've had many people ask me, and go, Steve, is this true? Is this real? Yes, it's real. It's real. And again, just because it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it's not real. So right now, there's people at the border who are protecting us from people trying to get in. And many of those people at the border also think the border extends 100 miles in, and it's different. And I think, by the way, I think people accept that there's a logical distinction there, okay? When I'm standing at the border, I'm on the wall, as Jack Nicholson would say. I'm standing sentry on the wall, protecting you people sleeping comfortably in your beds. Okay? The people who approach the country are all, by definition, questionable. They're not in the U.S., so we have to question them as they come into the U.S., right? But driving around inside the state of Michigan or inside the state of Florida or inside the state of Maine and questioning those people as if they are suspect, I think that's where most people recognize there's a problem. There's a distinction there that makes sense to most people. I think. So, again, as I approached the border yesterday and I saw the American flag, I'm welcome to the U.S., and I see a guy up there who wants to see my passport, I got no problem with that. Hand him the passport, answers questions. If he wants to search my car, I got no problem with that. I like to get on my way, and I did. But, like I said, that exact same interaction occurring 100 miles inland, someplace in the middle of the state of Michigan, that would bother me. And you might say, Steve, what's the difference? There's a big difference. And I think the difference is pretty clear. But like I said, that could just be me. So yes, there is a 100-mile exclusion zone as you go around the entire United States where the Constitution has some gray areas that most people didn't know about. There you have it. Questions or comments? Put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later.